Aloha mai kākoa and welcome to Understanding West Maui. My name is Alakai Lastimado, and today we're here and honored to have Ron Williams. Aloha.
Mahalo, aloha.
Aloha. Welcome. Mahalo for being here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just get straight into it. Sure. Now, in the book, Historical Investigations in West Maui, you're the only chapter where your title is only in Olelo.
Yeah.
Is titled Pane Aku Ko Maui Kumohana Na Poe Ilihune, Na Poe Vaivai, Na Ali'i, Na Kanaka, Na Maka'ainana.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit more about why you decided not to have a translation and just talk a little bit about that title?
Sure. Great question. I think for me, I speak Hawaiian. My PhD is in Hawaiian history with an emphasis on Hawaiian language resources. So it's been a goal of mine for a long time to just do a little less translation every time almost. And the reason is, it's a difficult question because it's complex. When you go Makalona Hawai'i Vale no, only Hawaiian, there's an audience that can't access that. What I've started to come to understand over the years is that sometimes that's okay. If it's a sentence or two that you are leading them into a topic or something, maybe they'll take the time to put it in Google or whatever and try to find out what it says. Maybe they won't. But it's acknowledging that idea that Hawaiian is an official language of the state for one thing, law-wise, but also culturally, it's asking people to, if you are looking to access knowledge about Hawaii, maybe take that step and learn a little bit of Hawaiian and so forth. When we go abroad, a lot of times, I get questions. That's the first question I get on every talk I do, is because I'll use a lot of Hawaiian language resources. And they'll say, well, what are you going to translate all the newspapers that you're talking about? And I'm like, well, when are you going to learn Hawaii? So it's, and I don't mean it's absolutely not a punitive thing. In this case in particular, that quote, that's part of a quote that comes from Kauikeaouli, Kamehameha I. He has an oft-quoted passage that he said in 1825 as a 12-year-old, where he becomes monarch of the kingdom. And he says, I want my nation to be a nation of literacy. Well, that's been quoted quite a bit, and people talk about it and so forth. In writing this chapter about Hawaiian kingdom education, I thought, I want to go back and research that quote. And it turns out it was a part of a long passage. And the passage that I include talks about, I want my nation to be a nation of literacy. The poor, the rich, the young, the old, ali'i, maka'ainana, the chiefs, the commoners, everyone. And so in doing the research and finding out how West Maui really embraced that challenge of their king, and everyone learned to read, I wanted to make that title kind of inclusive and show how Maui responded to that. So Pane Aku is to respond. So the king challenges his people to learn, and they respond.
Okay, so you talk about King Kamehameha III wanting Hawaii to be literate, or to be a literate kalamai. Now, at what point, at one time, Hawaii was the most literate society. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, literacy arrived a little bit, mostly in 1820 when the missionaries arrived, the creation of printed text and so forth. And he quickly understood, it's so interesting how we're in the last 20 or 30 years in Hawaiian history and in Hawaiian cultural studies, we're really shifting our narrative. 25 years ago when I was at Kamakakula Center for Hawaiian Studies doing my undergrad, we were taught that theory that, the white men arrived in the Pacific and brown people fell by the wayside, and so forth. And so everything that Kanakaʻiwi actually accomplished was granted to, that was because that was put on them by the haole, by the foreigners. By reading the primary source materials in Hawaiian, we start from those chiefs. We start to understand that this was a plan. The Pacific was being taken over by countries around the world, Europe. Spain had taken the Marquesas by mid-century. France had taken French Polynesia, and so forth. Hawaii was next. I mean, it's geographically in the center of the Pacific Ocean. So it would have been taken. They have no standing army. They were the only chance that Hawaii has to remain an independent country is to create a country that the other countries respect and say that's a legitimate country. And so he's not brainwashed into bringing, this here or that here. He sees that as a way to save his country. And Olelo is part of that. Language is part of that. So he makes this plea. The chiefs go out in every community around the islands, and they send their retainers out, learn English, teach the people, and so forth. And so you have this massive spread of literacy that's unheard of in world history. One of my areas of my PhD is world history, and I've never seen anything like this idea that you introduce literacy, and within 3 or 4 decades, the population's almost universally literate. Yeah? You'll hear folks quote numbers, and to be honest, those are a little sketchy. What we do know is that around 90% or more of the people were literate. And that's from the missionary writings and the English writings and the school stats and so forth. And so when you place that against world literacy, you find out that's one of the top 2 or 3 nations in the world. And that was accomplished not by, credit to the missionaries who arrived and brought literacy, but that was accomplished by a nation of engaged people who taught their families and everyone how to read. Yeah.
Okay, so your piece, your chapter in this focuses on West Maui, right? Yeah. So what was the story of education? Was it the same across all the islands, or was each island different when it came to education? Did West Maui have a little bit more or a little bit less, or how was education across the island?
Yeah. So it was similar to what happened on Maui. There were, by that time there was a unified nation. Post 1840, there's a constitutional monarchy. Prior to that, there was an absolute monarchy, right? The king was a deity; he ruled. 1840, they become a constitutional monarchy, and these written laws become universal around the nation, so that a law passed by the kingdom applies in Hilo and Lahaina and everywhere else. That said, Lahaina was played a specifically important role in education. Number one, for Lahaina Luna. Lahaina Luna was the missionary seminary up on the hill in Lahaina, and it was started by the American Protestants. They're mostly Congregationalists and Presbyterians, right? And they start this school called Lahaina Luna to educate the future leaders of Hawaii. So they're bringing Hawaiians in and teaching them geography and math and all these different things to help them rule a country that's moving into this new era, right? And so that's what the role Lahaina Luna plays. Around Lahaina also you had, Lahaina was the capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom until 1850. So up until that period, that's where most of the elite Inui lived, which means their retinues and so forth and so on. So it really was kind of a capital of education too. Now that said, I do need to note, and I found this fascinating, was around 1862, King Alexander Liholiho, who was Kamehameha IV, him and his wife bring the Anglican Church from England to Hawaii. And one of the motivations for that, again, up until recently, we've kind of erased Hawaiian action from history. Things just happened to them. So, this church came, and how did, what happened to Hawaiians? No, it was deliberate for them to bring the Anglican Church to Hawaii because that was a contestation of the American Protestant mission, right? The nation is American Protestant. The American missionaries are kind of running some things. By that time, after they've been here for 30 or 40 years, the king is realizing that, there's other people out there that have ideas too. These Americans are kind of haughty, a little cushy, and so forth and so on. And since Hawaii was a monarchy originally, they reach out to England, another monarchy, and they bring the Anglican Church. And Alexander Liholiho does that to contest that rise of power of the American missions. So they create a school in Lahaina called Lua'ehu that has almost been lost to history. Like I haven't bumped into anyone else who knew about it. And it was on the beach in Lahaina, and it was specifically set up by Queen Emma to educate future leaders of Hawaii, which is the same thing they're doing up on the hill in the American fashion. Down here, they're doing it in British fashion. And also, an interesting side note, she insisted that the students at the school learn in English, right? So, another one of those misnomers, we've come to believe, English is the bad language and Hawaiian is the good language, and English took over. Not untrue historically, but the complexity is that in 1860s, nobody thought Hawaiian was going to disappear. It was everywhere. That was your home language, school, everywhere else. And then in school, she was teaching those students English, which made them bilingual. Yeah. So up at Lahaina Luna, where the American mission is teaching, they're teaching them in Hawaiian. And so when they're graduating in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, they're not as able to compete and so forth because they don't know English. So it wasn't this oppression of English. It was this becoming dual literacy.
Yeah, so interesting. I love this. Yes, that it's awesome. Okay, so I have to ask. You have many stories in your chapter. In the historical investigations. What is your favorite? Do you have a favorite story that you have? I have, so, and can I ask you about one of mine? Sure. No. Sorry, you're gonna go straight into it.
Yeah, that's great.
Maria Kurua, tell us. I know it's a little sad story, but I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah,
And that story.
that was one of the two that I had in my head.
Yeah.
Again, it is not. It's not a favorite story. It's one that impacts me the most.
Okay.
So my goal in most of my research is to identifying Native Hawaiian agency. Not only how Hawaiians acted upon, how they act, how they react to things, and so forth. Because we haven't heard that story. We've heard, 90% of what we heard comes from the foreign voice. So in this case, I'm looking for agency. But then I came across this story that reminded me that it's not a black and white thing. It's not 100% versus 0% thing. In the education system in the Hawaiian Kingdom, throughout the 19th century, Hawaiians had a huge amount of agency, maybe more than they do today. Probably more than they do today. Schools were set up by local parents. Teachers were were hired and fired by local parents and so forth in the kingdom. Now that said, there were still these pockets of power that were reserved for basically white men, even in this system. So while there was agency, there's also, don't forget, this is there. And one of those cases was Maria Karua. It's very interesting. She spells her name Karua, which is a kind of a one way to spell Kalua, right? But she lives in Paia, up in upcountry Maui, and they had examinations for teachers every 2 years, where people could come down and try to get their teacher's license. And this was a really good job. This was a lifetime job from the government, decent pay and so forth. She came from a poor family, and her good friend Mrs. Noah from upcountry Maui came down to take the exam in 1888, and the exam was given by the principal of Lahaina Luna School, the American Protestant school, a white man. And so you've got the students all there taking the exams. And Mrs. Karua, I'm going through the thousands and thousands of letters in the Board of Education archives, that we have at the state archives. And I come across this letter from her, and it's written to the president of the Board of Education. And already that's kind of a piece of agency, because this is a young, woman who's from a poor family worth of writing the president of the Board of Education. It's a serious deal, who happens to be Charles Reed Bishop at the time. And so she writes him, and she lays out this event of what happened when she took the test. And she says to him, while we were taking the test, the principal, the gentleman, came up to me and gave me a note at my desk. And the note said, if you want to achieve your designation, your ticket to teach, you're going to need to do something to please me. Meet me downstairs in the basement, and so forth and so on. And so we kind of all know where that's headed. In her letter, she said, I didn't really understand what he was saying. And I showed the letter to Mrs. Noah, who said, you know what he wants you to do, right? And so she said, I was aghast. I tore up the letter and I threw it away, or threw it down. As the day moves on, he cancels the test early, closes down the test early, follows her outside and tells her, I told you not to show that to anyone. She gets Mrs. Noah, and they go on to get their boat back to go to Ma'alaya, to go up country, to go home. She's home 2 or 3 days, and this gentleman appears at her house up country. There's a sheriff who's lives next door, who sees it, who documents it and everything. And he tells her, why did you tell, and so forth and so on. So it launches this investigation because of her boldness to bring this up to light. It launches an investigation within the Department of Education. And Charles Reed Bishop hires to do the investigation a man named the not so Reverend Kalamai, the Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop, who was probably the most hardcore racist of the day. Hated Hawaiians, was really about gathering power. Again, a minister. He says in a letter that I found back to Charles Reed Bishop, before he begins his investigation, he says, my opinion is he didn't do this. And the reason I know he probably didn't do this is I have a great experience with the higher class of Hawaiian women in churches and schools and so forth. I know them. And not 1 in 10 Hawaiian women would have turned down such an offer. I mean, a really horrific thing to say. It's like, there's no way she wouldn't have done this. And then he says, besides, she wouldn't have lost any status in her community. So again, these kind of vile attacks on her character and so forth before he's even begun the investigation. The investigation goes on for 4 or 5 days. Her minister upcountry says she's an absolute, she would never lie. This is a truth-telling woman and so forth. Mrs. Noah verifies the story. And as the investigation goes on, correspondence goes back and forth between Bishop and Charles Reed Bishop, not unrelated. And it comes to be basically the decision is, well, to take him out of Lahaina Luna would upset our educational goals much more than this smaller incident. So they didn't fire him, and she never got her certificate. So she goes home, and I wasn't able to follow her afterwards. But what happens to her, and what happens to her family, and so forth? So in being proud of Native Hawaiian agency within these institutions, we'd have to never forget racism, sexism, chauvinism also still exists.
Yeah. So, okay, well, you said you had a second one in mind. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You're here, and
Yeah.
have the author here, another favorite story, or another story that impacted you.
Yeah.
With writing.
You know what? To be honest, I think it was that overall story, because I do a lot of community talks. I do talks in churches and online and stuff like that. And there's this, and this is my experience of that. This isn't history. No, this is my experience of that. And that is, in every talk I give, I have eventually a kupuna or two, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, speak up and say that they were moved by the material of how intelligent their ancestors were. And then they go on to say that they grew up understanding that Hawaiians were opala, were trash. Yeah. I have a quick story. I was a grad student that I was staying in Palolo, and I was a single dad. I had my daughter with me, and we stayed with a woman named Mrs. Nobriga. She was Native Hawaiian Portuguese. She, like many Hawaiians of that era, spoke no Hawaiian. Both her parents were fluent. It was of that territorial era where you learn English, get a good job, and so forth. And so she thought it was really, she got a kick out of the fact that this haole boy in her house was studying Hawaiian stuff. So every night I would come home from school and she would ask me what I learned, and we'd talk, and she's a wonderful lady. And one day I invited her to a graduation of my friend, Kimo Armitage. He has a PhD. He was getting his PhD in English. And so I invited her to the luau at Kamakukulani, and she said sure. She came, and we had food and dancing and everything. And I introduced her to Kimo. He's kind of fair-skinned. And I asked her later, I said, Auntie, how you like Kimo? And she goes, oh, smart, that haole boy. I said, no, Auntie, he's Hawaiian. And she didn't pause. She didn't even start to think. She said, Hawaiian, get a PhD, And for me, that was impactful because I started to understand her self-internalization of those ideas that Hawaiians aren't smart inherently, right? When we go back into the 19th century and we do this research like this chapter and we read these things, we come to understand not only did they exist, what they achieved was amazing. And I'll give you one example if we have time. There's a essay I found in the Lahaina Luna papers. There's a man named Richard, it could be Pelakai, it could be Pelakai. Okay, I'm not sure. He's 16 years old. He's at Lahaina Luna in the 1880s. He has to diagram a sentence as part of his final for English, which I hated. I'm a professional writer. I hate diagramming sentences, right? I really don't get it. He says, and the sentence they give him is, because the Nile is such a wonderful river, the resources around that area are rich, something like that. And he starts to break it down. He says, this is the non-verbative this, the third person clause this, and he goes on for 3 pages. And I read that in talks I give nowadays to teachers, and they're blown. Like, are you kidding me? Like, he analyzes that sentence for 3 pages, and he's doing that in his second language, right? In English. So that kind of stuff just blew me away. And so when you understand what Kanaka Oiwi were and what they were told they were later, that's, I get emotional sometimes, but that's an incredibly positive and inspiring thing. Yeah.
So why do you think your research on educations and the chapter that you have, why do you think it's so important for today's society and possibly for the future?
Yeah. For the reason I mentioned just now, but also just this, as a historian, I have my personal views and I have the people that I support and all this stuff, but I really take seriously that role of a historian, which is simply take the voices of the kupuna and bring them and connect them back to the community, right? I'm not telling you what to do about it, which I'm asked a lot. Who should we follow? What should we do? That's not my kuleana. My kuleana is to take those resources and bring them to the community. And the reason why it's vital is because we've heard so little. I mentioned earlier about the 90%. When I do my talks, a lot of times I'll talk about the 6%. Helen Chapin, who was an author and a researcher of newspapers. She said in 1893, the time of the overthrow, about 6% of the population was fluent in English, right? The Haole crowd, which means 94% weren't. If you go into the library today, state library, any library, and you pull Hawaiian history books off the shelf, even to this day, many people are doing this, but after all of our work, I would estimate 96, 97 of those 100 books don't have a single Hawaiian language resource in them. They're all taken from that 6%. Everything we've understood about Hawaii comes from that 6%. And the argument isn't that Haole sources lie and Hawaii sources tell the truth. The argument is we've gotten such a tiny point of the picture. There's been a crime and there's 10 witnesses and we've asked one and we've walked away. So what we're doing and why I think it's vital, and again, there's many people doing this, is that we're bringing those other voices into the conversation. And it starts to help us understand Kanaka Oiwi and their accomplishments and their faults, so much better.
Well, mahalo for the research that you do, because it's definitely, education is very important. But as much as we can talk about education all day long, I have to move on because there's another topic that I'm very interested in, which is a topic in the book Civil Society in West Maui, and you talk about the origins of the Kamehameha Day Parade.
Yeah.
Can we go ahead and just talk about that?
Sure, that was
Kind of very interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating for me to do. And I was asked to do it basically focusing on the Lahaina Pa'u parade.
Okay.
But I had to do a back history of the parade in general. And it was pretty amazing. One of the stories within that I found is super interesting was I found about the first Pa'u parade in Hawaii. There was a woman who lived in Waikiki who had a Pa'u horse organization, and in 1906 they launched the first Pa'u parade, which went from Waikiki up down to downtown. It went to Washington Place to honor the Queen, and then went on to the Kamehameha statue. And so that started this thing that today is still going on, which is the Kamehameha Day Parade, right? But as part of that investigation of that celebration of that day, a couple of things. Number one, I got to do a lot of oral interviews, and I interviewed princesses and queens who won the parade, and I asked them about things, and it was fascinating because those things that I've seen around the community, and those things that I've thought were maybe inherent are, and that is, one woman told me, one wonderful woman who'd won like 4 years in a row, she told me, she said, the Pa'u parade is not about Kamehameha Day. It's about that year of preparation that I take my girls out and I teach them how to gather and how to make their horse lay and how to do this and the ceremonies to do and the protocol of asking permission to take flowers from that tree and so forth. And all of those things that make up what Kanaka Oiwi are part of that celebration that goes on long before that day where they march down the street, right? So that was fascinating for me. A second one was a woman, and I'm going to forget her name, a wonderful woman who had won 4 or 5 years in a row, and she was Mahu. She was a man that has transitioned to be a woman, and I talked with her, and she said something that really blew me away. So I asked her about her. She was very open. She said a lot of the women hated me because I would win, and they said I wasn't a woman and so forth. So I can imagine going through that. And then she said, I said, how did this start? And she said vividly, she said, I remember when I was 9 years old, and my grandmother took me to the Kamehameha Day Parade. And we were sitting down in Waikiki, and I was sitting on the corner of the cement, and I looked, and the Pa'u ladies came by, and she said, I wanted to be that one day, and she ended up being. So it incorporates those ideas of inclusion that Hawaiians have, incorporates these ideas of being able to dream about being something great in Hawaii and doing that, and all of those things. One of the other things that I found fascinating about the research for the parade was that the parade originally was mostly about athletics. There were races, there were donkey races, there were swimming races, there were surf events, and the parade today, for better or for worse, has turned in more into a traditional parade. I was speaking with the woman who ran the parade on Maui about this, and she was very excited. Maybe in the future we'll have a surf contest, maybe we'll do this. But there's a story within that was great. The surf contest on Maui was in 1872, 1876. Still, the parade was pretty new, the holiday was. And part of the holiday was a surf contest in Lahaina on Uo Beach, right on the front of Lahaina, Front Street. And the newspaper Hawaiian Language newspaper has a description of it that's in detail. And there were 3 entrants for the surf contest, and one of them was a wahine, was a woman. Ooh. And these 3 men, and the one man was supposed to win. He was known by everyone and so forth. And it was done with what they call today break wall in the wharf. And the surf was huge. And they described this beautiful contest and the wahine ended up winning. And so it's kind of a cute, but also a significant documentation of the fact that in the 1870s, women and men surfed against each other, and this woman came out victorious. So that was one of them. But that idea of the races and the physicality of that, I thought was an honoring of Kamehameha and his status as a physical warrior. Right? So those types of things, maybe pieces of that celebration we've lost that may come back because of that. Yeah.
So before we let you go,
Yeah.
I have to ask you, you did write the first territorial legislature, right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I was looking at the politics of that era, right? From 1893 to 1900, Hawaiians were basically shut out or chose not to take part in politics because it was a white oligarchy that ruled the nation. So they were either forbidden to or, making a protest and not voting. But when 1900 happens, I like to think that the Haole government, the oligarchy government said, they had a party actually at the palace for the supposed annexation that night. And I like to think they woke up the next day and said, oh, crap, what do we do? Because by becoming part of the United States, supposedly, you're bringing in some pieces of democracy back from this oligarchic government. So in 1900, the governor is appointed, the executive is appointed, the judiciary is appointed, but the legislature is going to be voted on by the people of Hawaii. So Hawaiians come together, form their own new party, and they defeat the Democrats, they defeat the Republicans, and they take over that legislature. So for the first time since 93, you have Hawaiians in some bit of power. The story of that legislature has been written by two authors that said look how horrible things run when you let Hawaiians run things and so forth and so on, because hardly anything got done in the end. By researching it from the primary source documents, I found out Hawaiians passed 57 different bills benefiting Native Hawaiians and others, and almost every one of the bills was vetoed by Governor Dole. So that's the story of that legislature. And one in particular that goes to Lahaina was the fact that as they're pushing for a county, so they ended up having counties starting in 1905, but this is 1901. And one of the main things Hawaiians are pushing for, the Hawaiian Party is pushing for, is to create counties so they can decentralize power, right? Because the Governor Dole is it. And so they actually get enough votes, they pass the county bill. Again, it's vetoed by Governor Dole. But part of the county bill was they wanted to rename the counties of Hawaii, the islands actually, because there were no counties at the point. So they were renaming the islands after the early Inui. So Kauai is going to be Kauikioli County, Oahu is going to be Kamehameha County, and they say the island of Maui is now going to be called Liliuokalani, right? So just after that dispossession of her crown, just after that loss of crown lands and all of these things that she's gone through, Native Hawaiians get into the legislature and rename Maui after her. And there was actually a article in the Maui News that was a little too premature that said the name of the island has been changed to Liliuokalani. That was before the veto, right? So that part of history, again, just a snippet of Hawaiian action and agency within a larger story.
Well, once again, mahalo for all of your ike, and mahalo for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Until next time, aloha, ahui ho.
Me kanani ku kila kila.